Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Bill Sternero, and I'm the Associate Director of Campus Police Services. So in partnership with Campus Police, the Division of Equity and Inclusion, this training, Hate Crimes or Bias Incidents, is being brought forth by the BEST team, which is Bias Education and Support Team. In addition, the BEST team, I wanted to mention, they're sponsoring additional learning opportunities in the future. Just be on the lookout for them. So it's my pleasure to introduce Assistant Prosecutor Heather Hadley, a former colleague of mine from the Mercer County Prosecutor's Office. Heather has an extensive bio, so I took some liberties and shortened it up a little bit, quite a bit. So she's been with the Prosecutor's Office here in Mercer County for 15 plus years. Currently, she's a Senior Assistant Prosecutor. She's worked in various units within the prosecutor's office, including juvenile, special victims, domestic violence, grand jury, trial, and homicide. Additionally, she was the chief of insurance fraud and Megan's Law unit. She's currently assigned to the homicide task force as an on-call assistant prosecutor, which entails her going out when there is a homicide and working alongside police detectives and officers to on the homicide itself, offering legal advice and investigative advice. She's currently assigned to the, as the chief of the human trafficking and bias crime units. She's been in both of those units for approximately 10 years and acts as the bias crime and human trafficking liaison for Mercer County for the state of New Jersey. She's an instructor at the Mercer County Police Academy, is married and has a 7-year-old son. So without further ado, friend of mine, Heather Hadley.
Thanks, Bill. Thank you everyone for having me. I appreciate you all coming together and letting me speak to you and address a very important topic. It's my honor and privilege to be here with you virtually. I would love for us to be able to try and one day get together in person, because I love to get questions and get some feedback from people and answer as much as I can. So please, if you do have questions and you want to ask them, just go ahead and put them in the chat, and then we'll just kind of field them at the end. If some of this is things that you already know, I would ask you to just, go ahead and share if you have any comments within the chat so that I can expand on things that maybe I didn't spend enough time going through for you. I'm here just going to give you some general information about bias crimes versus bias incident in New Jersey. And I also am the Mercer County Bias Crime Liaison. So I also want to talk to you and give you some ideas about what kind of incidents we are seeing, especially after COVID, and now that we're all online, what kind of things that we're seeing here in Mercer County. Let me share with you my screen. Okay. Okay, so first I'm going to start by just talking about a little bit of laws that are here protecting people against bias or hate crimes. And I do get a lot of questions with regards to what is the difference between a bias or a hate crime. And really the word is interchangeable. In New Jersey, we have what is called a bias intimidation statute. It has been referred to, of course, as a hate crime statute, but the technical name for it is bias intimidation here in New Jersey. So that's why when I talk about bias and hate crimes, I'm going to use the two words interchangeable. I get that question all the time. But just as way of background, since 1979, nearly every state has enacted some form of a bias crime statute. And most common are what's called penalty enhancement statutes. And also we do have what's called criminal civil rights statutes. So when I talk about penalty enhancement statutes, I'm talking about a statute, a law that is created, which will increase an already existing criminal offense. When I talk about a civil rights or an ethnic intimidation statute, what I'm referring to is a statute where there does not have to be an underlying offense, and that the act itself would be the crime. For instance, cross-burning statutes, there are many states that have that particular statute or law on the books that says that if that type of behavior is done, the act itself would be the crime. Doesn't matter necessarily if there was any particular, it's pretty evident what is happening when you have a cross burning incident. It's because it's targeting a certain group, it's targeting, and it's a threat of violence. That in itself would be a crime that some states have that are directly on the books. Anti-masking laws, or laws which would prohibit interference with like religious worship. There are some states will have those specifically listed on their, as part of their statutes. In New Jersey, we have a penalty enhancement statute. That means that if there are individuals that are targeted because of a protected class, which I'll go into, then the offense that happens after would then be elevated to a bias crime charge. So I'll talk more about that. So we have in New Jersey a penalty enhancement statute. So who usually commits bias crimes? What are we dealing with when we talk about bias incidents and bias crimes? We're talking about members of hate groups. We see where there is a very organized way of going about trying to target and discriminate against certain individuals. Also, the majority are juveniles or young people where these incidents or these crimes are happening by as the perpetrators between age and range from ages 12 to ages 21. And we also are seeing that anyone who falls within certain elements, such as when we see an area where there's an increased population, where it becomes more diverse, you'll see more, of course, bias or hate crimes. Or there's a shift in service economy or economy uncertainty, especially now during COVID. We see a huge uprise in bias incidents and bias crimes throughout the state. Negative stereotypes and intolerance, of course, that always breeds intolerance and stereotypes and negative stereotypes will always breed some kind of bias crime or some kind of hate act. And racial divisions among youth in schools. We are seeing more and more where youth, young people are doing a lot of actions against one another on not only social media, but also more so online now that we are basically all at home and doing a lot of remote learning. And also increased violence within races, of course, we're gonna see a lot of bias and hate crime as well. So as I mentioned, New Jersey, we have a penalty enhancement statute. The bias intimidation statute can be found in 2C16-1. And really what it is, it's going to be a statute which says that if a person attempts to commit or works with somebody else or threatens an offense against somebody else to target an individual group or individuals that are either because of their race, their color, religion, gender, disability, sexual orientation, their gender identity or expression, national origin, or ethnicity, or if they knowingly participate or do some kind of act which would cause a member of that group to be intimidated, they can be found guilty of a bias crime. So in a little while, I'm going to talk to you about the difference between the crime and the incident. But first, just looking strictly at what the law is when we talk about a bias crime or a bias or a hate crime, bias intimidation. That is the law. When somebody is being targeted for a specific protected class, when there's a purpose to go after them, or there's a purpose to intimidate them, or when the motive is strictly to do something which they know would constitute an offense that would intimidate them in some way, that is when you can take a charge of an underlying offense and elevate it, make it a degree higher than what the underlying offense would be. So for instance, if an individual was being harassed and they're only being harassed because of their ethnicity, then the charge of harassment would be there. And then the elevated bias intimidation, the bias intimidation charge would also then be something that could be added to the harassment charge. So the harassment would be a petty disorderly person or get you in municipal court, and the bias crime would then elevate it. The 2C16-1 would make it a 4th degree bias intimidation charge. So they would have 2 charges. That's the essence of a penalty enhancement statute. When I talk about disabilities, of course, what's protected, people with HIV, with disfigurements, birth defects, mental health or psychological or developmental issues. Those are all covered, of course, as a protected class. So if anybody is targeting someone because of those particular disabilities, then there could also then be a bias crime charge. Gender ID or expression, having or being perceived as having a gender related identification or expression, whether or not that stereotypical associated with that person's assignment sex at birth. So if somebody, believes that someone is a male, even though they are actually a female, doesn't matter what the perceived gender is. If somebody's targeting someone based upon what they believed is the perceived identity, gender identity, and there's that underlying offense, then that could potentially be a bias crime charge. The 3rd section of the statute is still in the 2C. If you were to open up the statute book, you would look and see that it's still there. And essentially what it is that it's when when a victim feels as though that the circumstances that caused that victim to believe that they were being intimidated, they have reason to believe that the defendant acted with a purpose to intimidate. So instead of what the defendant thought or the defendant's purpose was, like in section 1 and 2, in section 3, it's more about what the victim considers to be reasonable, or what the victim believes was being done or happened to them was based upon their race or ethnicity. There was a Supreme Court case that came down that held that that kind of thinking with regards to how a victim felt about what a defendant did to them is unconstitutional. And we need to really be thinking about what the defendant's purpose was when they acted, when they did the acts, when they committed the offenses, not what the victim's perceived underlying feelings were about what happened when they were targeted for their race or ethnicity. So what's important to understand when we're talking about the bias intimidation statute, the crime first, I'm talking about crimes, is that it's going to raise the degree a little bit higher than what the underlying offense was. So if you have somebody that is spray painting the side of a building with a swastika, the criminal mischief is the underlying offense, the act of the vandalism that happened to someone's property. The swastika would be an indication that it is bias related, something against somebody's race or nationality or religion. So the criminal mischief is a petty disorderly person, gets them in municipal court. But because it was someone being targeted because of a protected class, the charge would be 1 degree higher, which would get them into superior court with a 4th degree offense, because the purpose for why they spray painted that person's garage or that building was to cause intimidation, was targeting them because of protected class. And therefore, there would be enough to charge that person with bias crime, and not just for the criminal mischief. It would be because of the bias intimidation being a purpose to go after someone because of who they were or what they looked like or religion that they had. When I talk about underlying offenses, what I mean is any other crime that is occurring. In order for us to charge a bias crime, there must be an underlying criminal offense first. So it could be murder, it could be manslaughter, it could be anything, burglary. There was a couple of years ago, there were Hispanic males that were being targeted for a series of robberies that were happening in the community. They were being targeted simply because of their race. We know that because of what some of the perpetrators were saying when they were assaulting these men. And based upon that, we had not only the robbery, but if we did find a suspect, we could then charge a bias intimidation, which would elevate a second-degree robbery. It would be a second-degree robbery, but then it would be a first-degree bias intimidation charge. Harassment, we see tons and tons of harassment cases related to hate speech or hate crimes or inappropriate and hateful and threatening comments. Those harassment charges or those disorderly conduct charges or those terroristic threat charges that are coupled with a bias incident that is specifically somebody targeting someone for their race, ethnicity, nationality, then could be charged as a bias crime. It's important that we know about these bias crimes and these bias incidents because our law enforcement, especially here at your own TCNJ, we need our officers and we need the police to be able to do their jobs. They have to know about the incidents that happen in order to help us make the cases for the crimes. So I talked a lot about bias crimes, but I also want to then mention the difference between a bias crime and a bias incident. You have to have an incident before we can charge the crime. Okay, so when we are looking at a bias incident, I'm referring to anything that happens that is directly related to somebody targeting or being motivated by some kind of hate or bias against a protected class, whether it be gender, whether it be disability, whether it be race, ethnicity, gender. Words that are uttered that do not ever amount to a bias crime will still be a bias incident. So if you're at a grocery store and somebody calls you a racial slur, that is a bias incident. It may not ever amount to a bias crime because there's no underlying offense that has occurred. There is no harassment. Maybe if it was a one-time thing, someone passed by you and decided to say something hateful. That is, although we don't want to believe it, it's just freedom of speech, someone passing by and saying something hateful. It's not a crime to do those types of things. I know we'd all want them to be, but it doesn't make it a crime because somebody calls someone a name. But when they act upon those types of hateful or racial terms and then start doing things that are targeting someone, like if it's someone is starting to threaten someone, or if it turns into a harassment and we have an underlying charge, and then we can also then trace back to the motive being only that someone was targeted because of the protected class, then we can take that bias incident and potentially charge under the bias crime statute. So there are tons of times where we'll have bias incidents, and we have them all over our county, we have them all over this country, in this state, but every bias incident that happens does not mean that it would be a bias crime. When we talk about understanding how to identify bias incidents, especially when you have, when you think it's the most minute incident that doesn't, this happens every day. Someone walks up to me and says something racial or says something sexist, and you think nothing of it and you keep passing by. Those little incidents that happened may be bigger than we think. Individuals may be going to other locations. They may be going to other colleges. And those types of acts may help us to build cases in turning bias incidents into being able to charge a bias crime. Because it's very difficult to show somebody's motive for doing something. And that's exactly what would be required to charge a bias crime. We would have to show that somebody's motive was to target someone of a protected class. So when we're trying to look for a motive, sometimes it's also important to look for the absence of other motives. If we start to keep track and we identify and we report incidents, we can then use the incidents that are reported possibly as evidence or information to then build on potential bias crimes of an individual who may then be going to other colleges, and the small issue that happened in one location may be the evidence we need to prove that their motives were not just their motives were at targeting individual people. So if we have to show and look at absent of motives, that's going to be helpful when we're looking at bias incidents in order to then potentially charge a bias crime. We're looking at displays of bias symbols, words, and graffiti. It's quite obvious. You see a swastika spray painted, what that symbol means. If you see the N-word spray painted, written in ink or in pencil or in marker somewhere, it's still an indication that somebody is probably targeting someone because of their race. We look at common fact sense of the fact of the review. We review the facts and look at it in a common sense kind of way. Do these people have any history together? Is there a reason that is there a reason why someone would be targeted other than their nationality or their religion? These people have no other connection. So if they have no other connection, then why is somebody bothering somebody else? And that analysis will help us to figure out if it's just racial, or is it two neighbors that just hate each other, or two roommates that have just grown to dislike each other and then happen to use a racial slur. But that doesn't mean that they are targeting someone because of their race. They just may be using very prejudiced words or racial words when they could be picking better words to use. We're looking at how a victim feels about an incident. That will play into account as to how we look at these incidents in order to then charge crimes. We're looking at statements from suspects. Suspects sometimes, when they feel a certain way about a religion, about an ethnicity, they want to talk about it and they want to share their ideology with anybody that'll listen. So sometimes the best statements come from those that are the perpetrators. Looking at statements made by witnesses, people around them. Well, I've never had a problem with this person. I'm of a certain race. Looking at a person that this has happened to in the past. Oh, they've done this to me as well. I don't know what I did. This person just keeps doing this to me as well. And they're of the same race as our victim, as our person that this has happened to. It's great evidence to show what their motives were. And the key, prior history of similar incidents. That's why the reporting is so important. If we can look back at prior history of an individual that's doing the same behavior over and over again to different people, that one incident may mean nothing, but 20 of those incidents happening over the course of several months is going to be helpful to show motive that could potentially result in maybe understanding that we have more for a crime to charge for a crime. And our law enforcement, because they are required to report these incidents, they need to know about these incidents so that they can be reported. We need to be able to track what is happening in our state. We underreport way too much, and I understand, because people, things may happen in everyday life and they're like, you know what, I'm just going to brush that off. That's really not that important. But it is important. It's important that because it will help deter behavior. The more that we know about them, the more we can do what we need to do to deter that kind of behavior within our communities. regardless if it's a statement that will not result in a crime. The incident itself is something that we as a society and us and you as a college should be able to report to the appropriate people and have some kind of action taken, whether it not be a crime that's charged, but an incident that is looked into, and then also trying to figure out and deter that behavior happening next time. Also, I always include bullying as part of the presentation because not only is it important for our school age kids, but it happens with adults as well, but it happens on college campuses all the time. It's a serious problem growing in schools, but it doesn't stop just because we're not in middle school or we're not in high school anymore. That same kind of behavior is happening, and maybe we're not calling it teasing anymore, but we're still, it changes its name and it's called harassment. And if we know that harassment is a crime and can be charged, and usually a lot of this bullying that happens, it's through social media, and it's rumors, and it's undercover, and it is really just targeting individuals based upon some kind of I say protected class, but some kind of vulnerability. And it still is a crime. There's something on the books called cybercrime, cyberbullying, cyber harassment. It can be, that is a charge as well. Somebody that's sending, text messages or Snapchats or Facebook messages and targeting individuals because of their race or calling people names and then making threats. There's a charge there of that could be called, and it's called cyber harassment. And if you have that underlying charge and it's also determined that you're going after someone or someone is targeting someone because of a protected class, that municipal court matter will then get them into superior court with a fourth-degree bias intimidation charge. So I always include bullying and cyber harassment because really that's all it is. People stealing, posting pictures of somebody or stealing passwords and targeting individuals just because of something they dislike about them, threatening or harassing them with offensive language. We see it all the time where it starts out as a joke, but then it escalates because now you've gotten everybody else involved that's on the Snapchat. And now you're starting to call names. I saw one exchange between students where it started out as a small disagreement and then it ended up being nasty words, racial slurs, distortment of history between the parties, and then all sorts of people got involved. And then that person that was targeted started feeling alienated. There was more people on the chat and really did start feeling like they were targeted and being singled out from what was happening. We had we have tons of incidents that are being reported to us in the last few months. And of course, this is just a snippet of the kind of incidents that we are seeing. An unidentified individual attempted to disrupt an open online prayer session. Security measures were put in place to protect, the board is blocking my view. Put in place by prayer session monitor. Once subjects were denied access, they sent harassing messages to the moderator, which included derogatory comments, and this was at a college campus. There was a road rage on another campus where a known offender called the victim nigger out the window. There was no other reason. There was no connection to these people. And that's an incident. And maybe it's heard and maybe it's accepted and no one wants to call the police or let anybody know about it. But that's an incident and that needs to be reported. Faculty member receives email from a person who identified themselves, and the suspect makes claims in the email that the faculty member was only teaching there because of his skin color. It's an incident. Maybe it's never going to amount to a crime, and there is no crime there. But it's an incident, and this individual could be going around doing that all over the place. And it's going to be good information for us to know in case we ever do find an individual who escalates from just calling names to doing a little bit more. Graffiti written on a pencil. So it's in pencil, so there's no crime. It can be erased. It's not criminal mischief, but it's still an incident that should be reported. And God hates fags written on a hallway bulletin board. We've seen incidents where individuals are Zoom bombing constantly. I got incidents from local high schools where this was happening, in general assemblies where individuals will change the names of their fellow classmates, act like they're someone else, and post hateful and derogatory words on a board, or they'll target specific people and start sending them cartoon messages and burning crosses and nooses. That kind of information, that kind of activity and that kind of nonsense during school or during any time is something that should be reported. And sometimes they just amount to conversations with individuals. Sometimes if they do have enough to be charged, let's say it does amount to a harassment, sometimes those cases will resolve in community service. Sometimes it's just evaluation so that people can get counseling or they can get, some kind of help that's needed to help them to not be so intolerable of other people. I know when I've had cases sending community service for people that they don't want to work with, sending them to organizations that they would otherwise have no affiliation with, forcing someone to work in a situation or being next to people that they really would rather not, is probably more of a punishment sometimes for these individuals than they want. So that's just some basic information, and I have my number and my information and is up here. I work with 2 other detectives and a lieutenant in our unit. We're constantly reaching out to people. We are constantly making sure that we are educating people. They need to report incidents regardless if charges will never happen. And I know we wish we could deter more, and we know that we wish we could charge more. And I tell people all the time, name calling is not against the law, but it's when you start to do something that is going to be directly harming someone, that is meant to be a direct or imminent threat of violence. That kind of speech is not protected, and that kind of speech could then result in a crime. But it really is going to be case by case. It's really going to become a test of whether or not we have any information to show that there's an absence of other motives as to why somebody is targeting another person. I hope that helps clear up a little bit confusion about bias incident and crimes. Are there any questions? Do you see any questions on that?
I don't see any. No one's typed. Anybody have any questions for Heather? Oh, there goes one.
All right, let me see if I can see them.
Can you read that, Heather, or no?
Yes. Okay, Heather, why isn't age included? Well, in New Jersey, we don't have an age is not included. It's just not something that our legislation has included as a protected class. We have, like I said, race, color, religion, gender, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, national origin, or ethnicity. That's not to say that things won't change. Our laws are always changing and evolving. If there was issues with regards to age discrimination, I believe it's covered federally, but I'm not quite sure. Do protected classes change from state to state, or are they universally across the US? They change from state to state. And in our statute, it doesn't cover age.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else? Oh my goodness, I answered everybody's hidden question about bias crime versus bias incident. Oh, wow. It's been my pleasure. If you do think of any questions, you think of anything you want to ask me, please reach out. I'm more than happy to always explain, sit down and talk with anybody that that this has happened to, and they're wondering why hasn't there been a charge for this. I sit down with victims, I sit down with people all the time and try and explain, because there's nothing worse than feeling like you're not being heard in situations like this. So, like in the case, I have another question. Like in the case of George Floyd, how can you prove bias incident of police brutality? So that's a pretty interesting question, because I don't know what their statute is and the state that they're in, but I can tell you that when you have in New Jersey the absence of other motives, that's really what's going to be key. Could we ever charge with a bias intimidation? I don't know. I don't know enough about anything underlying there. I don't think there's any question about what happened in that case with regards to motives. I don't think there's any question as to, what was happening in that situation with those officers and George Floyd during that time. But as far as it being charged as a bias intimidation in that state, I can't really speak to that.
Well, just not as a bias incident, but in the state of New Jersey, we have an early intervention notification process that the Attorney General put forth within the last year or two, I guess it is, Heather, basically for internal affairs. So that if an individual gets one or two, or I forget the exact number offhand, notifications for, could be something as simple as being late for work once or twice or whatever, that the Internal Affairs Office intervenes on that, speaks to the individual. So that would be something that would bring forth some sort of a bias that we would be aware of, that the prosecutor's office would be aware of eventually, because we're required to notify them of when someone does get a couple of incidents.
Right. So during that investigation, during the internal affairs investigation, there could be information that comes up which would help to further the identifying the motivation behind the acts that happened, in order to then be able to potentially charge with a bias crime. So depending on what the evidence would pull out, what you could get from it with regards to what the motives were, what was happening, was this person just targeted, which, because of their race, or was there something else? Did they have a history together? Not that they did, but those types of, that kind of investigation would take place in order to then figure out if you can make this incident into more of a crime, solely because someone targeted someone because of their race. You're welcome. Anybody else?
Well,
all right.
Thank you very much, Heather. Really appreciate you. I know you're busy spending your time coming over and speaking to the campus for.
It's my pleasure.
Again, on the 27th, I guess. You're gonna be back.
Come back. Yep, come back and do some version of this again, so I won't bore people if they want to come back and see me.
You're not boring, believe me.
All right.
Well, terrific. If there's no more questions, I guess, Carrie, do you have anything else to add, or?
I don't have anything to add. I want to just thank you for taking time to talk to us about this very important topic, and we do look forward to your second presentation in October. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to shoot them to either Bill or myself, and we can definitely get the questions over to Prosecutor Hadley.
Thank you very much. Y'all have a great
day. Thanks again,
day.
Heather.
Bye-bye.
Thanks all.